Good evening, my friends. I hope you're all doing very well. We're going to be learning tonight the 14th chapter of the laws of Shabbat in the Rambam in Maimonides. And we are currently in middle of learning the laws of transferring from one domain to another domain on Shabbat. So we have learned that there are various types of domains. And over here, the Rambam will go into the details of the 4 different types of domains that exist in regards to carrying on Shabbat. So it is a little bit complicated, but I will do my best to make sure that you guys can all follow along and have a very clear understanding of how carrying from one place to another on Shabbat, where it is permissible and where it is not. And this goes as follows. There are 4 domains referred by our sages in regards to transferring objects on Shabbat. And they are as follows. A private domain, in other words, a place which is a private domain. It belongs to a certain individual or it's grouped off, as we're going to see momentarily. A public domain, which is, as it sounds, a public area. Then there is another 2 which are, so to speak, in-betweeners. So it's not private, and it's not a regular public domain. And these 2 are what are called a Carmelit and a Makom Petor. I will explain what these are, as the Rambam himself will give us an understanding what they are. So let's start from the beginning. What is considered a public domain? A public domain, the Rambam says, is deserts, forests, marketplaces, and just general open land, which is a public area. And it has to be at least 16 cubits, not 16 cubits, rather 16 handbreadths. A moat, this is a handbreadth, one handbreadth. It has to be 16 amot is 16 cubits, not handbreadth. This is a handbreadth. 16 cubits wide. So 16 of these from your elbow to the end of your hand, 16 amot wide. This is a Torah counter. It's the way in the Torah it's counted. This is called an amah. So 16 amot in plural wide is a place which is considered a public domain, and it doesn't have a roof. No, it's not covered, and it's just open, a place where everyone can go. What is a private domain? So the Rambam says a private domain is a place which is either, there are different ways it can be a private domain. Either it is higher up than the regular public domain, so it's like a mound, like a little hill that is at least 10 handbreadths high and at least 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths in area. So in other words, this is a handbreadth, so 10 of these tall. That's how tall it has to be, and it has to be like a place for its own that is considered its own place. So that can be a private domain if that's sectioned off, it's on its own. Same thing also if it's deep. If there is a hole in the ground, which is also the same, it's 10 handbreadths deep, it's like a pit, and it's 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths wide. So then again, it's going to be counted as a private domain in regards to Shabbat. Meaning that we're not allowed to take something from a public domain and put it into that private domain. Similar, vice versa. Now then, there is obviously the classic private domain on Shabbat, which is just a piece of property which belongs to someone, and they have gated it in. So in other words, even if you have a place which belongs to you on Shabbat, but it's not closed off, it's not gated in from the rest of the public property, which it's right adjacent to, you are still not allowed to carry within that private domain, because since it is open to the public domain, so therefore you can still not carry there. If it's just on flat land. As if we said, like we said before, if it is something which is deeper, it's a hole in the ground, or it's on a hill which is 10 handbreadths tall, so then you would be able to. But if it's just a regular continuation of the street, so then it has to be gated in. And the Rambam says that the way it has to be done is that there has to be at least 3 walls. We'll understand what walls mean, but 3 sides that are gated in, and then at least 1 more pillar that will be serving as the beginning of the 4th wall. In such a case, you would be able to carry within that private domain. Now, but the Rambam says that when we're talking about a private domain, it doesn't necessarily have to be a place that belongs to one person. It could actually be an alleyway which has doors to many different people that live in that area, in this path. And if they close it off and they make a gate around it, so then they would be able to carry there on Shabbat. It's going to be counted as a private domain. It's private for these people. Similar, you can even actually have it around an entire city for that matter. If you have a city which is walled in, and there is a door, there's a gate, and it's locked, it's a place which is a private domain. And even if there is no lock, still if there is a wall, and again, a wall doesn't necessarily mean an actual wall. There are ways to make these gates, but it's closed in. In other words, it's symbolized as a closed-in area. So then this would be counted as a private domain in regards to Shabbat, even if it's surrounding an entire city, and you would be able to carry with it. And this would be even if it's a big vessel or a boat or a closet, whatever it is, if it's its own space, if it's 4 by 4 handbreadths and it's as tall as 10 handbreadths, so then this would be considered in a complete private property, private domain in regards to Shabbat, and you can carry within that domain, but you can't carry out of it. You can't transfer something from within it to outside of that area, or vice versa. And the airspace within that private domain, so if it's within your garden, or if it's a place which is gated in, as we said, then that airspace all the way up is still considered that private property. So you're allowed to throw something high up without any problem, because it's still part of that private property in regards to Shabbat. It's that private domain. So you can throw a ball, you can throw whatever it is, and that's totally fine, even if it goes very, very high. As long as it's within the parameters of that area, that's okay. But now comes the third concept of this third type of property of domain on Shabbat, which is what we called a makom petor. A makom petor literally means a place which is not liable. Because, let's go back to the origins of Shabbat for a second. The laws of Shabbat, these 39 primary laws of Shabbat, came from the various things that they were doing when they were building the temple, the miniature temple, the tabernacle in the desert. And there were 39 capital labors which they were doing. One of these was they were transferring items from one wagon to another wagon. So they had special wagons and where they would carry the tabernacle when they were traveling, and they would transfer from one to another. And the way these wagons were that they were at least 4 by 4 handbreadths, and there were 10 handbreadths off the ground. They had probably these big wheels, if they had them back at that time. But however they transferred it, they had these big wagons, and so that is what is considered a private property, a private area. This is based off these wagons. Now, they were transferring, so that's something which we are not allowed to do on Shabbat. So Moses told the Jewish people, this is what we're not supposed to be doing on Shabbat, based off what they were doing for the service of building the tabernacle. But then there was space in the public area which was beyond the height of what they were carrying. So they were transferring at the level of 10 handbreadths tall, but beyond 10 handbreadths, there was no transferring taking place. So the question is this considered as the rest of the public property, the rest of the public domain? Or is there a difference? So the answer is there is a difference. And this is why it's called a makom pator. A makom pator comes from literally pator in Hebrew means non-liable. So this is a makom, a place which is not liable. Meaning, if you transfer something to that domain on Shabbat, you are not liable. So, if you are able to be in the ear of the public area, the public domain on Shabbat, you are actually technically allowed to carry there. Because this is not a public domain. It's actually not a private domain either, but it's not a public domain. And you're allowed to transfer from a public domain to that makom tor, to that non-liable airspace, and you're allowed to transfer from within there into the public domain. And you're also allowed to transfer within that space. So practically speaking, this is talking about 10 handbreadths tall, which is just about, I would say about 3 feet, give or take. And that's something which, that is the space which is above, the airspace which is above the public domain. The problem is because there is gravity, and if we're standing on the ground, even if we're holding it high up, but we're still standing on the ground, then it's not going to help that we lift something high up to transfer it on Shabbat. So it is only in a case when we are entirely in that airspace. Which actually has a very interesting outcome, is that technically speaking, if you take a flight, right, if you're flying on Shabbat, technically, if you're in your space in the air, and you're going to fly throughout the entire Shabbat, for the whole 25 hours length of it, from when, if you took off before Shabbat, and now you're traveling in this airspace high up in the air, for the entire Shabbat, technically that would be okay. Now, it doesn't really exist. There aren't flights that are 25 hours long within the time zone of where you took off, where you'll begin Shabbat and end Shabbat. But anyways, that's where it starts getting complicated. But it's just an interesting thought. So, that is the idea of a makom pator. Then we have another type of domain, which is called a Carmelit. A Carmelit on Shabbat is a place which is a downgrade from a public domain. So it's like a public domain, but it is a downgrade. Meaning, if you have a place, if you have a little hill, which is, again, 4x4 handbreadths, which would technically make it into a private domain if it were higher than 10 handbreadths high. But in this case, it's actually not 10 handbreadths. It's only between 3 handbreadths to 10 handbreadths. So it's lower. It's a lower mound on the ground. And that area, since it is lower down, is not going to be considered as a regular public domain because it's higher up. But because it's lower than 10 handbreadths, it's also not going to be a private domain. So it's going to be an in-between. So there is an idea of this in-between space. And the Rambam defines this area of the makom, of the Carmelit, which the word Carmelit, the commentators of the Rambam describe by saying that a Carmelit comes from the word Carmel. It's like the Mount Carmel. So it's the word Carmel, which in Hebrew we find in the Torah. It's a term which is used for wheat that is not entirely ready. and it's almost there, but it's just not ripe yet. And that's the idea, that it's not ripe yet. It's not exactly a public property, and it's neither a private domain. And it's somewhere in between. So it's not ripe, so to speak. So it's the idea of caramel, the unripe. So, in such a case, the area of the Carmelite over there, it's similar to a public domain in many of its regards, and therefore we're not allowed to carry over there. But if a person does, so then they wouldn't be liable in the same way as if it was a public domain in its full sense. And it's very interesting because there is a discussion in commentators and in Jewish law in general. The Rambam was Sephardic, right? He was a Sephardic Jew, and he wrote the laws according to the Sephardic tradition, I would say. Not that there are many major differences, but there are slight ones. And I usually point them out when there is. Over here is one of the places. There is in the Code of Jewish Law, it talks about the idea of a public domain. And it says that a public domain, as we said, needs to have, it's an open space. It has to be at least 16 cubits wide. But then there's another important detail that it talks about in Jewish law. The Rambam doesn't mention this, which is that there has to be at least 600,000 people going through that place on a daily basis. Similar to the way it was with the Jewish people in the desert. That public domain, there were 600,000 people, at least. And they were in that area, and that was what was considered a public domain. A private domain was something which is closed off for less people. So therefore, many authorities will say, many Torah authorities will tell you that a public domain on Shabbat is only when there are 600,000 people going through that area. So for instance, if you go to 5th Avenue in Manhattan, that's definitely a place where there are 600,000 people going on a daily basis, and that's definitely counted as a public domain. But if you take a little street in the middle of Pensacola, well, there are no 600,000 people going through it. There aren't even 600,000 people in this entire county. So, this is not considered a public property. A public domain in the same regard for Shabbat. But the Rambam doesn't actually mention this detail, which is very interesting. And it would seem that the Rambam would consider a place which is a public domain, which has many people, but not necessarily so many people, that this would still be considered as a public domain. So, obviously, we are stringent in regards to this, and even a place which is considered as a Carmelite, which is a place which is the in-between, which doesn't have the same amount, doesn't have up to 600,000 people, even according to those opinions, we would still be careful not to carry over there. But it could very well be that the Rambam considers even a smaller area, even a smaller street, which doesn't have so many people, to still be considered as a public domain. But in any case, this area, which is lesser, it's not as public as the public domain, would be called the Carmelite, and it would have the stringencies. The rabbis gave it the same stringencies as a public domain, since it is so similar. Now, so when we're talking about all of these various places, so now there are obviously many details, and the Rambam goes into them, and he talks about, for instance, if you have a ledge within a public domain. So you have a ledge which is sitting on the side of the road, and it's high, it's above 10 handbreadths, and it's 4 by 4. So that's going to be considered a complete private domain. So you're not allowed to actually put something down onto it. Right? Now, but if it is less than that, So then that would be considered a Carmelite. A Carmelite because it's 4x4, but it's less than 10 handbreadths. So that's like a little edge. So that you would be able to put something down onto it on Shabbat. And the Rambam continues in these various types of situations to discuss what would be allowed and what would not be allowed. So I'm going to go through some of it. And he says like this: if we're talking about a place which is the Makom Ptor, this place which is not liable. So he says, since it's technically a place which you're not liable, so therefore you're actually allowed to carry there. But a place which is a Carmelis, which is similar to a public domain, so officially you're not allowed to carry there. But if there is something for which you're moving something, but not for the item itself. In other words, if there is a something which is dangerous, which is sitting within the road, if there is maybe like if there is a certain article like a thorn which is dangerous, which is sitting within this Carmelite area, one is allowed to move it to the side of the road. Because you're not actually moving it because you want to move this thing for this thing itself. You're just trying to take away a danger from people that are walking on the street. So in that case, the rabbis didn't put that stringency if there was a danger for people. Even if it's not a life-threatening thing, but because it's something which is dangerous. To a certain extent, people shouldn't get hurt. So then the rabbi said, yes, you're allowed to move it to the side of the road, even if you're moving it a couple feet. Now, if a person throws something from a public domain, and if a person takes a like a spear, like a long stick, and he sticks it into his public domain, right, into his garden. And now, from the outside, from the public property, he throws something and it lands onto the top of the stick. If there's maybe a little platform, and he throws it and it lands onto this thing, he would still be liable because, as we said before, the private property goes all the way up. If it was the other way around, though, if a person throws something from a private property and it lands onto a space that is higher than 10 cubits, 10 handbreadths, if he throws something from the private property and he throws it into public property, but it's landing onto a pole which is higher than 10 handbreadths high, that height is already not considered public domain. It's already what is called Makom Ptor, which is the place where you're not liable. So then the person would not be liable. So it's very interesting in the details of how these things work. And the Rambam finishes off the chapter by talking about if you have little irrigation ditches of water that are flowing through a public domain. So he says if they're not very deep, so then they're discounted as just as the rest of the public domain. Even if it was wide, it doesn't matter. Because since it's not so deep, since it's not 10 handbreadths deep, so it's going to still be considered as the same area as the public domain. But if it was very deep, so then it would be a Carmelite, and so then it would be considered as a Carmelite. But that's the end of the chapter. And basically what he does over here is to really define these 4 types of categories. So whenever we discuss these later on, we will understand what we're talking about. So we have a public domain, we have a private domain, and then there is a place which is on top of the public domain. 10 handbreadths and higher, which is called the makom ptor, the place where one would not be liable. And then there is a place which is not as public, but it has the same stringencies as a public domain. And that is called the Carmelit, which is not fully ripe, as we said. It's not completely a public domain, but it would still have the same stringencies. So that is the end of the chapter for today. I hope you understood what was going on. It's a little bit complicated, and I will agree with you if it's a little bit hard to follow, but I am trying my best to make sure that you can learn all about these various important details of Shabbat. So have a very good one, and we'll see you all tomorrow.